My name is Ethan. My girlfriend, Clara, and I met 3 years ago as freshmen at the University of Chicago. It's been my dream school since I was a kid, and I still can't believe I made it in. Neither of us are from Illinois. We're both from small towns in Indiana. Clara's from Bloomington, and I'm from a little place called Martinsville. I think that's part of why we clicked so fast. There's something about being from the same state, the same kind of quiet, middle-of-nowhere upbringing, that makes you feel like you understand each other without even trying. Most of the students at UChicago are from big cities, Chicago, New York, LA. So being from the Midwest made us stick out in a way that felt comforting. One of the traditions we've built over the years is how we split the holidays between our families. Clara's a hit with my relatives. They adore her. My mom always says she's the kind of girl you bring home, and my little sister looks up to her like she's a celebrity. Since her house is only about 2.5 hours from mine, we decided early on to spend Christmas Eve with my family, who celebrates with a big dinner and gifts that night, and then drive through the night to her place for Christmas Day. Before Clara, I didn't realize most families wait until Christmas morning to open presents. It's funny how you don't notice those little differences until someone points them out. But honestly, my favorite part of the holiday isn't the dinner or the gifts. It's that late night drive. It's become our thing, something we both look forward to every year. The first time we did it, it felt magical. The roads were empty, the snow was falling, and it was just the two of us, the hum of the engine and the glow of the dashboard lights. The route from my house to hers is mostly back roads, endless stretches of farmland, dark forests, and the occasional flickering porch light from a distant farmhouse. It's always so quiet, like the world is holding its breath. We rarely see another car, and when we do, it feels almost intrusive, like they're trespassing on our little tradition. We always play The Weeknd during the drive. I know it's not exactly Christmas music, but his moody, atmospheric sound fits the vibe. Clara and I have been obsessed with his music since we met. There's something about singing along to his lyrics in the middle of the night, the snow falling outside, that feels intimate in a way I can't really explain. It's like we're in our own little world, untouchable. This past Christmas Eve started like any other. After a cozy night with my family, dinner, gifts, the whole nine, we packed up my car around midnight and hit the road. The snow was coming down lightly, just enough to dust the roads and make everything look like a postcard. The music was playing, the heat was cranked up, and everything felt perfect. But that all changed in an instant. What happened next is still the most unsettling thing I've ever experienced. I was driving along, singing along to Blinding Lights, when my phone rang. I glanced down, annoyed. Who the hell would be calling me this late? It was an unknown number. I ignored it, figuring it was just another spam call. Those things are relentless these days. Clara made a joke about how even scammers don't take Christmas off, and I laughed, brushing it off. But then, a few minutes later, my phone rang again. Same unknown number. I sighed, irritated, and let it go to voicemail. Clara gave me a curious look and I shrugged. Probably a scam, I said, trying to sound casual. She nodded, but I could tell she was a little uneasy. The music started up again, and I tried to shake off the weird feeling in my gut. Of course, not 2 minutes later, my phone rang a third time. I snapped. I grabbed the phone, swiped to answer, and barked, "Hello," into the receiver. There was silence on the other end, just a faint static that made my skin crawl. I turned up the volume in the car, trying to hear better, and that's when the voice spoke. "Hello, Ethan?" I nearly swerved off the road. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The voice was deep, gravelly, and cold, like it didn't belong to a person but to something else. Something wrong. I couldn't speak. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The voice continued, calm and deliberate. It started listing things, my full name, my address, the name of my high school, even the make and model of my car. Details no one should know. Details no one could know. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. I wanted to pull over, to stop the car and scream, but I couldn't. I just kept driving like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. "What do you want?" I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The voice paused, and for a moment, there was nothing but that awful static. Then it said, "I'm not here for you, Ethan. I'm here for Clara." Hearing her name come out of that voice was like a punch to the gut. I glanced at Clara, and the look on her face made my blood run cold. She was pale, her eyes wide with fear. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, she reached over and hung up the phone. "What the hell, Clara?" I shouted, slamming my hand on the steering wheel. "Why would you do that?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me, her breathing shallow, like she was trying not to cry. I tried calling the number back once, twice, 3 times, but it just rang and rang. No answer, no voicemail, nothing. "We need to keep driving," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Ethan, just keep driving." I wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She was terrified. So I kept driving, the silence in the car heavy and suffocating. The snow was falling harder now, the flakes swirling in the headlights like tiny ghosts. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind us, but the road was empty. About 10 minutes later, Clara started crying. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks, and she kept wiping them away like she was embarrassed. "I don't feel safe," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what's happening." I didn't know what to say. My mind was spinning with questions. Who was that guy? How did he know so much about me? About us? Only my family knew we were driving that night, and I knew they'd never do something like this. Clara's family wouldn't either. So who was it? And why did Clara hang up the phone like that? The rest of the drive was silent. I didn't play any music, and neither of us spoke. When we finally pulled into Clara's driveway, I felt no relief. If anything, the fear had only grown, like a shadow stretching out in the dark. It's been almost a month since that night, and I still don't have any answers. We asked our families, and they all swore they had nothing to do with it. Clara insists she's just as clueless as I am, but I can't shake the feeling that she's hiding something. There have been little things over the years, white lies, half-truths, moments where I caught her being less than honest. I've always brushed them off, but now I can't stop wondering. Whoever that was on the phone, they knew things they shouldn't have. They knew where we were, what we were doing, and they knew Clara's name. I've been on edge ever since, jumping every time my phone rings. I know it's not over. I know they'll call again, and when they do, I'm not sure I'll be ready for what comes next. I used to live in the city. The hustle and bustle, the endless noise, the constant movement, it was the life I always thought I wanted. But after a traumatic event I'd rather not discuss, I couldn't stand even the faintest sounds. My therapist diagnosed me with phonophobia, a rare condition where noise triggers an overwhelming sense of dread. Imagine the prickling sensation of a limb falling asleep, but in your chest, like your body is perpetually bracing for an invisible threat. Car horns, slamming doors, even the hum of a refrigerator, it all felt like a physical assault on my nerves. I couldn't live like that anymore. 2 years ago, I found a cabin deep in the forests of northern Vermont. I won't say exactly where, partly out of caution, partly because I don't want anyone else stumbling into what I experienced. The place was perfect, isolated, surrounded by towering pines, and miles away from the nearest town. There was no cell service, no traffic, no neighbors for at least a mile, just silence. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built from weathered logs and crowned with a moss-covered roof. Inside it smelled of cedar and damp earth, like the forest had seeped into its bones. The fireplace was made of rough-hewn stone, and the windows were small, almost like they were designed to keep the outside world at bay. It felt safe, like a fortress against the chaos I'd left behind. For the first few days, I reveled in the quiet. I'd wake to the soft chirping of birds and fall asleep to the whisper of wind through the trees. The only sounds were natural ones, and for some reason they didn't set off my phonophobia. It was as if the forest had its own rhythm, one that my body could tolerate. I worked remotely on my laptop, so I didn't need to venture far. The isolation was exactly what I needed. Then, about a week after I moved in, there was a knock at the door. The sound was so unexpected that I froze mid-sentence, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The cabin didn't have a doorbell, so the knock was sharp and deliberate, echoing through the small space. I hesitated, my heart pounding. Who could possibly be out here? I wasn't expecting visitors, and the nearest neighbor, if you could even call them that, lived a good 15-minute walk through dense woods. I opened the door to find an elderly woman standing on the porch. She was hunched slightly, her long gray hair tangled and damp, as if she'd been caught in the rain. Her eyes were a piercing green, almost unnaturally bright, and they seemed to bore into me. In her hands she held a wicker basket filled with jars of preserves, jams, pickles, and something that looked like honey. "Hello," she said, her voice low and gravelly. "I'm Eleanor. I live down the trail." She gestured vaguely toward the woods. "Thought I'd welcome you to the neighborhood." I forced a smile, though her presence made my skin crawl. There was something off about her, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and her smile didn't reach her eyes. Still, I didn't want to be rude. "Thanks," I said, taking the basket. "That's really kind of you." She didn't respond right away, just stared at me with those unsettling eyes. The silence stretched on, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind. Finally, she spoke again, her tone shifting to something almost ominous. "Keep your lanterns full," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Your windows shut tight, and your wits sharper than your axe." I blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" She didn't elaborate. Instead, she turned and walked away, her footsteps eerily silent on the wooden porch. I watched her disappear into the trees, the basket of preserves feeling heavier in my hands. Her words lingered in my mind, more like a warning than a greeting. I set the basket on the kitchen counter and didn't touch it. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't say why. The jars were dusty, their labels faded and peeling, as if they'd been sitting in a cellar for decades. I shoved the basket into a corner and tried to forget about it. That night, a storm rolled in. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and rain lashed against the windows. I lit a few candles and curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the flickering power. The storm didn't bother me. In fact, I found the sound of rain soothing. It was the kind of noise that didn't set off my phonophobia, a natural symphony that lulled me into a sense of calm. But the peace didn't last. Around midnight, there was another knock at the door. This time it wasn't the polite tap of earlier. It was a heavy, insistent pounding, like someone was trying to break through the wood. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze, the book slipping from my hands. The storm outside was raging, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Who would be out in this weather? I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the door, my pulse racing. Through the small window beside the door, I saw Eleanor standing on the porch, drenched and shivering. Her hair clung to her face, and her eyes were wide, almost frantic. I opened the door a crack, the cold air biting at my skin. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" "There's someone out there," she said, her voice trembling. "Near your woodpile. I saw them. You need to be careful." I glanced past her into the darkness, but the rain made it impossible to see anything. "Are you sure? Maybe it was just an animal." She shook her head vehemently. "It was a person. I saw them." Before I could respond, she turned and hurried back into the storm, her figure swallowed by the shadows. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing. Her story didn't make sense. If she lived 15 minutes away, how had she seen someone near my cabin? And why had she been out in the storm in the first place? I locked the door and checked all the windows, my unease growing with each passing second. The storm continued to rage outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat in the living room, the flashlight in my lap, and listened. The minutes dragged on, the storm slowly subsiding, but the tension in the air remained. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. A branch snapping outside my bedroom window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was unmistakable, sharp and deliberate. I crept to the window, my heart pounding, and peered through the glass. At first I saw nothing but the dark outline of trees, but then movement caught my eye. Eleanor was standing at the edge of the woods, her back to the cabin. Her hair was wild, her posture stiff and unnatural. She didn't move, didn't turn, just stood there like a statue. My stomach churned as I watched her, a cold dread settling over me. What was she doing out there? And why was she just standing there? I ducked below the window, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Should I confront her? Call the police? But the nearest town was miles away, and the storm had likely knocked out the phone lines. I stayed crouched by the window, my body trembling, until I finally worked up the courage to look again. She was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, clutching the flashlight, and waited for sunrise. The storm passed, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax. Maybe it had just been my imagination, I told myself. Maybe Eleanor was just eccentric. But then, around 7 a.m., there was another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't Eleanor. I looked through the window and saw a man standing on the porch. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard and a bald head. His clothes were ragged, his boots caked with mud. And his eyes were empty, like two black holes staring straight through me. I didn't open the door. I backed away, my heart pounding, and retreated to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I called 911, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The operator assured me help was on the way, but it felt like an eternity before I heard the sound of breaking glass. The man was inside. I crouched in the bathroom, my breath coming in shallow gasps, as I listened to him smash through the cabin. Furniture toppled, glass shattered, and the walls seemed to shake with the force of his rage. I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and guttural, but I couldn't make out the words. The police arrived eventually, but by then the man was gone. They searched the property, but the woods were too dense, too vast. They found no trace of him or of Eleanor. When I told them about her, they exchanged uneasy glances. "There's no one living out here," one of the officers said. "Not for miles." I moved out the next day, leaving most of my belongings behind. I couldn't stay in that cabin, not after what had happened. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. And Eleanor, I don't know if she was trying to warn me or if she was something else entirely. Some people say the woods are alive, that they hold secrets older than time. I don't know if I believe that, but I do know this. There are things out there that can't be explained. And sometimes the silence isn't peaceful, it's waiting. The sinister rider. This happened about 6 months ago. I've been driving for rideshare for nearly 4 years now, and I've always preferred the late-night shifts. The roads are emptier, the tips are better, and there's a strange kind of peace that comes with driving through the quiet streets of Hollow Creek, the small town I call home. But there's a trade-off. Every now and then, you pick up someone who leaves a mark on you. Not in a good way. I've always considered myself cautious. I've dealt with my share of strange passengers, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that night. I didn't have a dash cam back then, but after that night, I installed one immediately. It started off like any other shift. Just me, my beat-up 2008 Subaru, and the occasional creak of the suspension that I'd been meaning to get fixed. The car's old, but it's dependable, and it's gotten me through more late nights than I can count. The streets were deserted, just the way I liked them. Around 2:30 a.m., I got a ping for a pickup at a gas station on the edge of town. Seemed routine enough, but something about it made my stomach twist. You know that feeling when something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That's exactly what hit me as I drove toward the location. Before I even saw the guy, I realized why I was feeling uneasy. The gas station I was pulling up to was closed. The lights were off, the pumps were dark, and the parking lot was completely empty. As I got closer, I saw him. I slowed down to get a better look. He was pacing back and forth in front of the building, wearing a tattered jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. I'm not exaggerating. There were actual holes in the sleeves, and the fabric was stained with something dark that I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. His movements were erratic, like he was fighting some invisible force, and he kept glancing over his shoulder like he was being followed. If I had to guess, he was on something, or running from something. I should have canceled the ride. My finger hovered over the button, but for some reason, I didn't press it. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors. He slid into the back seat without a word, and I immediately regretted it. The moment I took my foot off the brake, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Most passengers mind their own business. They scroll on their phones, stare out the window, or make small talk. Not this guy. He just sat there, staring at me through the rearview mirror. Not blinking, not looking away, just staring. His eyes were dark, almost hollow, and there was something about the way they locked onto mine that made my skin crawl. I tried to avoid his gaze, but every time I glanced in the mirror, he was still there, watching me. He looked angry, but it was more than that. It was like he was studying me, sizing me up. I turned on the radio to break the silence. I don't even remember what station it was, but the second the music started playing, he snapped at me to turn it off. His voice was low and gravelly, like he'd been chain smoking for decades. It caught me so off guard that I jerked the wheel, nearly swerving into the next lane. I didn't argue. I turned the radio off and gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. We drove in silence for a while. I kept hoping he'd just sit there quietly until we reached his destination, but then he spoke. I'll never forget the conversation. He asked me if I'd ever picked up someone I shouldn't have. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I let out an awkward laugh and said, "I hope not," trying to keep it light. He didn't laugh. He didn't even smile. He just leaned back in his seat and muttered something under his breath that I couldn't quite hear. Then he started talking about how he used to drive for a rideshare company too, but he quit after some kids broke into his car and stole his stuff. He was slurring his words, so I couldn't catch everything he said, but the way he told the story made my blood run cold. He kept smiling, this wide, unnerving grin that didn't match the tone of his words. A normal person wouldn't smile while talking about something like that. It was like he was enjoying it. He finished his story with a line that still haunts me. "It's funny how much trust you put in someone sitting right behind you." That's when it hit me. This guy wasn't just odd or high. He was dangerous. My pulse quickened, and I could feel my hands starting to shake. I kept my eyes on the road, but my mind was racing. I glanced at the GPS, focusing on the destination like it was my only lifeline. But he didn't stop talking. He started rambling about things that didn't make sense. Some of it was disturbing, some of it was just gibberish. I couldn't keep up. Then, out of nowhere, he started apologizing. Not to me, though. It was like he was talking to someone who wasn't there. "I didn't mean it," he kept saying over and over, followed by frantic "I'm sorries." I didn't respond. I didn't dare. I didn't know what he'd done or what he was capable of, but I wasn't about to find out. We were only a few minutes from his stop when he suddenly yelled at me that I'd missed the turn. I hadn't. The GPS clearly showed we were on the right path. But I slammed on the brakes anyway, my heart pounding in my chest. He demanded that I pull over, so I did. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. As soon as I shifted into park, headlights appeared behind us. It was a police car. I've never been so relieved to see flashing lights in my life. I said a silent prayer as the cruiser crept closer, its spotlight sweeping over my car. The guy in the back seat slouched down, trying to stay out of sight. I turned my head slightly and saw him lying almost flat on the seat, his eyes closed. He looked like he was trying to disappear. I whipped my head back around, trying to steady my breathing. He stayed like that for what felt like an eternity. I wanted to tell him to get out, but I didn't dare. Finally, he lifted his head and said, "You got lucky." Before I could react, he opened the door and vanished into the night. I sat there for a moment, my heart still racing, before calling it a night. I was too shaken to keep driving. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I found out just how close I'd come to real danger. I came across a news article about a gas station robbery that had happened the same night I picked up that guy. The station was 2 blocks from where I'd found him. The article mentioned that the suspect was still at large, and the description matched the man who'd been in my car. It made me sick to my stomach, knowing I'd been inches away from someone who could have hurt me, or worse. I thought about going to the police, but I've always tried to avoid law enforcement for personal reasons. I'm not sure my report would even help at this point. All I know is that I'm a lot more careful about who I let into my car now, and I never drive without my dash cam.